how important is retreat practice? Like for someone new?
Retreat practice is essential. If someone is a serious spiritual practitioner, if they really feel the burn for truth, for awakening to ultimate reality, then they're going to have to do in-person retreats.
Welcome. My name is Todd Mushin Lisonbee, and I'm joined today with Stephen Mugen Snyder, Sensei. Mugen is a lineage teacher in both the Theravada and Zen traditions. He's the author of several books, and he's also my teacher. So this will be interesting. So welcome, Mugen.
Thank you. Nice to be here, Mushin.
Yeah, so it's not every day you get to interview your teacher, so hopefully I'm not going to mess this up too badly, but no promises. So I wanted to talk about a few different topics. I wanted to talk about more about your background, kind of what you teach, I guess, kind of the things that the major topics you teach. I want to talk about some sort of beginner kinds of questions. So like starting a practice, retreat practice, and then working with a teacher. So hopefully this will be interesting for someone kind of new, or also to people that have been practicing a while. Since I'm familiar with their teaching, hopefully I can ask some interesting questions. So
Sure.
we'll
Sounds good.
see how it goes. So to start with like your background, I think something interesting about you as a teacher is that you're authorized in multiple traditions, that you've also practiced in even more traditions than that. And so right. Maybe we could start, I guess, maybe let's just start with how you started meditating,
Sure.
if you don't mind.
No. Well, I normally start this with saying my first exposure to Buddhism and Zen was when I was 3. I was in Japan with my family. I grew up in Guam and Hawaii, and we traveled to Japan 1 or more times a year typically. And really just being on the streets of Tokyo, I saw a Zen monk jogging down the road, I guess late for something. And just seeing the figure of the shaved head and the black robes billowing behind him as he ran down the sidewalk was really impactful. I felt like I was, as the Brits say, I was gobsmacked, like I had just this aha moment. And the interesting experience for me was my inner dialogue was, there I am, which was an odd thing for a 3-year-old to say, I think, in reflection. So that was sort of a very meaningful experience to me. And later my family got involved in Christianity for a little while, or they're still involved. I was involved for a short while, but didn't find it sort of spoke to me. There was something about having to go through the intermediary, the priest, that didn't resonate. But when I was in my teen years, I began meditating. Actually, I started meditating 2 ways. One is I did a lot of camping and backpacking in those days, and outdoor fires would be a common place that I would, whenever there was one, I would sit quietly in front of the fire. And I learned years later that some of the American Indian tribes have fire watching as a kind of spiritual practice. So there is some basis for that. And then I would use the red light on my stereo. You used to have stereo components, and they'd have a sort of an on light, a red light. And I would sit in the dark room and just look at the red light, and that would be my meditation. I didn't know what I was doing, but I felt better afterwards. I felt relaxed and calm. And then at about age 19, I really was feeling the angst of later teenage years and early adult years, and feeling pretty anchorless for lots of reasons. And I was living in San Francisco at the time, went to the San Francisco Library and ended up getting a couple of books on Buddhism, of which there were only a small number in English in those days, in the 70s. So, but read a book, and then ended up getting a copy of a book called The 3 Pillars of Zen by Kapla Roshi. And that was really our Bible for many years. That was one of the first practice books in English for the Zen folks. And in there, he had instructions on counting breath. So I spent my first 2 years counting breath. And I could sit, I think my first meditation was about 5 minutes. And that was a stretch. I was probably done after 2 or 3 minutes, but I persevered for that 5 minutes. But I felt something important happen. I felt like my grounding cord got connected when I first sat. So I knew that there was something about coming home for me, and that this was something I needed to include in my life. And I have meditated daily since then. So it's been almost 50 years now that I've been doing this.
Yes. I thought it's interesting, the bringing up nature. It seems like, do you think of meditation as something that just would happen naturally if, we weren't living in these complex societies, just living more out in nature? It's just kind of a normal human activity. Is that how you see it?
I do. I think all of us, or most of us, if we're out in nature, I would suspect in our early human years that probably we were out hunting and gathering, and there had to be times there was no need to travel any further, and there was nothing exactly to do but wait. And I suspect that was part of what was happening, was we were getting more attuned to nature at that time. So I think as part of our human psychology, about our brain mechanics, I think we have a way that nature, for most people, is a reset. So I think naturally we'd go into some communion, connection with nature if we weren't so busy.
Yeah, and the 5 minutes was also quite interesting, because when I talk to people about meditation, they'll often say, people that don't meditate, they'll often say, "Oh, I can't meditate." It's like they sit down and they can't sit for 5 minutes, but that's just part of the natural process. Is that what you would say?
I think so. I hear the same thing, that people typically, if somebody's brand new, and I will say I don't work a lot with beginners. I seem to get people who are more intermediate to advanced. But when I do come in contact with new meditators, often I'll tell them to start with 3 to 5 minutes, once a day. And when that gets a little comfortable, then start, if you can, an evening counterpoint, so 3 to 5 minutes twice a day, and then work from there, because we get more stable, we get more comfortable with it all, and can sit longer and longer.
Yeah, yeah. And then my understanding is, kind of next, you spent about the next, I don't know, somewhere in there, you started in the Zen tradition for about 20 years of practicing. I mean, you're still in that tradition, but you were primarily in the Zen tradition for about 20 years, starting relatively young. How did that unfold for you?
Yeah, that's accurate. I started practicing and was contacting a couple of Zen teachers, trying to find where I felt like I fit, or where it was a good place for me to practice. And I had a little bit of difficulty with that, in that some of the Zen centers really, well, most of the Zen centers were very Japanese then. Not all the teachers were Asian, but a lot of the forms of practice and the way of doing things was very, very much Japanese. And there was kind of a high church about it to me. It was, they had beautiful vestments for the monks and all this. And I found it a little off-putting. I wanted something simpler, that was more about sitting and less about the pageantry of it, the ceremony of it. And so I did. I found a teacher. My first teacher was Kennett Roshi, who was a British woman who was teaching in Mount Shasta, California, Shasta Abbey. And I did sesshin with her, and I attended a number of functions with her. And the main reason I was attracted also was, they had, when I went for sesshin there and did my first jukai, I think they had maybe 80 or so monastics, male and female, and probably 15 or 20 had experienced Kensho awakening. And the reason I know that is because they had a special garment that they wore when they were transmitted teachers. and the transmitted teachers all had Kensho. So this was a place where I could see, 25% of the residents had an awakening experience. So something was happening there. So I found it really useful to practice. She was a very strict teacher in lots of ways, but really it was a great way for me to learn and to learn to sit a lot. That was common. And little tidbit, my first sesshin there I did in the late 70s. One of the other participants, lay participants with me, was a man named Steve Gray, who you may know as Adyashanti. So we did, I don't know if it was his first session. He was younger than I was. I was probably 20 then, and he was probably 18 or something. So a young fellow also, but a great meditator. He was able to sit for very long periods. I was not. I could sit the 40 minutes and squirm the last 10, I think. That was pretty typical for me at that time. But I really took to it, and then from there I gravitated toward the San Francisco Zen Center folks. Practicing a little bit at San Francisco Zen Center, attending, a sit here and a day there kind of thing. But I practiced with several teachers in that lineage, which is a Soto Zen lineage. So the practice focuses on shikantaza. And just to say, when I learned it, shikantaza, you were given no instruction on the meditation, but given elaborate instruction on bodily posture. So we knew that, but I went around to more senior folks and asked, what are you doing in meditation? And every person I asked gave me a different answer. So I realized that there was no consensus on what's happening in the meditation. We're all just sort of showing up, and whatever's here is here was basically the approach. So I'll just say I did probably for about 10 years, the last 10 years of that 20-year period, I was doing 4 retreats a year. So with different teachers. So I was quite active, and I was the attorney for several Zen centers and the Roshis, and so I got to know teachers that way as well. So it was an interesting time, but I learned a lot and practiced a lot to great benefit, and sat a lot at home. I sat probably a couple hours a day at home during that period as well.
Okay. And then eventually you branched out into Theravada Buddhism. Is that what came next?
No, I started first with dabbling in some Theravada and some Tibetan.
Okay.
I had met somebody who had come back from, I think, Thailand, and who had learned some of the Brahmaviharas. At that point, there were no books on it. And so he kind of gave me a little bit of a verbal presentation on it. And it was quite simple. And so I did that and found it very helpful to do. It wasn't anything the way that I would practice it today, but as a kind of a starting point, it worked well. And then the Theravada came about a little kind of interesting. Other than the Brahmaviharas, the heart practices, I had a friend who had gone off to Myanmar, to Burma, to be a monk and to learn this thing called jhana practice. And I had never heard of it. There were, I think, one book in English on jhanas, and it was not commonly known. But the fact he had left this high-paying corporate job, to go do this was quite impactful. And so then at one point he organized a retreat a couple of years later here in California, and with his teacher, Pa-Auk Sayadaw, and invited me, and I ended up attending that retreat and doing the practice with the Sayadaw at that time.
Okay.
Let me jump it back. What I did get involved in Tibetan Buddhism also. I spent about 5 years practicing the Dzogchen Rigpa practice. That was my main focus, and little bodhicitta, or the heart of awakening. I did some of those practices as well.
Okay.
But the Tibetan was just a little too ornate for me, a little too complicated. I'm a simpler practitioner than that, I think.
Okay. Interesting. And then with Pa-Auk Sayadaw, that's when you became authorized to teach, was sometime after that retreat?
Yeah, during that retreat, which was a 2-month retreat, another student, Tina Rasmussen, and I both completed the samatha portion, which is a enormous amount of meditative practices, all different practices, but we were able to do those and finish. And afterwards, the Sayadaw contacted me and asked if I would write a book about the jhana practice. And so I wrote a first draft, probably about a 60-page first draft. And then I shared it with Tina. We were married at the time, and I shared it with her. And after some convincing, she agreed to come on and co-author it with me. And so together we produced the second version, which was about 90 pages or 100 pages. And we originally self-published it because the Sayadaw wanted it out immediately. And so we found a self-publisher at that point that edited the book and then produced it. And I used to mail out all the copies to people. We'd sell it online, and people would, send me 3 copies, and I'd mail them the copies. And then we finally got some outfit to do it for us.
Okay.
But we did that, and then eventually we submitted it to Shambhala, and then worked with them, and they published Practicing the Jhanas.
Okay, interesting.
First book I was a part of. Yeah,
I hadn't realized there was the extra steps beforehand. Yeah, so I've got the book.
Yeah, it was called.
Got the book here. Yeah.
Yeah, and the first book was called something like Spiritual Advice from Two Friends.
Oh, really? Okay, interesting.
I think I got a few copies around here somewhere, but I don't remember the exact title.
Now I can scour the used bookstores to
Yeah.
pick up the odd copy, maybe.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, and at that time, and then when the book came out, the self-published version, the Sayadaw invited us to the Forest Refuge. He was going to be teaching a 4-month retreat there in Barre, Mass. And he asked us to come for the first week. He wanted to have us each teach to the students, give Dharma talks, and also he wanted to have us shadowed on one-on-ones. And so the Sayadaw shadowed me on one-on-ones, and another senior Sayadaw, Ujagara, shadowed Tina while she interviewed with folks interviewed with her. And then we each gave Dharma talks. And at the end of the week, when we were done, he authorized us to teach and said, basically he just said, go, you're authorized to teach, go do it. Very little instruction, very little training. We just sort of began figuring it out using our book and our experience, just trying things out and seeing what worked. And it was an interesting time because in the Theravadan community, there was a lot of concern about the jhanas as a practice. And so there was a lot of Theravadan, Western Theravadan teachers that were extremely discouraging of practicing the jhanas. They didn't think it was necessary. It was too hard. People would become addicted to the jhana states or the jhana experiences. And so we had a lot of pushback from teachers on our teaching. And Tina and I talked about it and decided we weren't gonna resist at all. We weren't gonna fight back. We weren't going to answer anybody's criticisms. We just didn't respond at all. And eventually people got tired of criticizing those that were. And we ended up getting incorporated more into the Theravadan world. And then they began introducing Theravadan jhanas based on the Brahmaviharas, which is different. We were doing breath awareness jhanas. So that kind of allowed them to have a way to present the jhanas that gave them some credibility. And so I think it was also that we were teaching something they didn't have the capacity to teach. And Pa-Auk is very, very respected. The Western Theravadan teachers, I would imagine even to this day, highly revere him as a meditation master and a Buddhist scholar. When you're on retreat with him, going for interview, and you ask him a question, he first quotes from memory the Buddhist sutta, the teaching of the Buddha, in Pali, which is the language the Buddha taught in, and then he gives you the English translation. So really an amazing teacher to be around. And you can feel the depth of his realization. It's like this force field around him that's intoxicating. But anyway, so that was how we got authorized to teach.
Yeah, it's interesting because I guess even in Theravada Buddhism, there's really, really multiple lineages and different ways of seeing things, I guess.
Yeah, and in Asia, they have a lot of friction in Asia. So a lot of the different Theravadan teachers, if you could speak one of the Asian languages, you would find, I don't know what they call them, but they used to call them like community boards or whatever, but websites where people are commenting on things, and they all criticize each other. That you're not doing the Buddha's teaching. This is wrong. That's wrong. And the Pa-Auk people do it too. So it's not like they're immune from it. my approach has been to not do that. I respect all teaching that's being offered, and I don't think what I teach is the best. It's the best for me. It's the clearest for me, and it works for my students. But I don't critique anybody else's style or teaching, because there's lots of teachers are teaching authentically in different ways.
Yeah. 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 That this book was really impactful for me, practicing the jhanas. I think it was recommended to me early on when I started meditating. And I just really enjoyed the clarity and the simplicity of the book, and how few words were really used to describe the process and the development. And so, yeah, this, yeah, thank you. and then and then I guess you led retreats teaching those practices for some years, and then right. And then next you did a stress reduction book for lawyers, I think.
I did.
And then
it worked. That probably did about 10 years of teaching. Tina and I co-taught in those days. We were team teachers. And about the 10-year mark, we both were not unhappy with the teaching, but it was clear that we were both beginning to teach a little differently than the other. Yeah. And for the first 10 years, we tried to harmonize and present a kind of a solid message, a unified message. But it was clear that she had more Tibetan experience than I did. She had done a couple years more of retreats than I had, and so was a little more Tibetan savvy. And I, of course, had my Zen years. And so I found myself kind of beginning to bring in Zen stories and my, talk about things. And so we just recognized that we were both developing in ways that we each needed more autonomy, which ended up also impacting our marriage, that we realized we both needed more autonomy in a relationship as well. We were very similar, and our practice styles were similar. Our realizations were similar. It was almost like we were too much of twins. We needed more autonomy. And so we separated our teaching life, and then ended up divorcing as well, which was the right thing to do for both of us. Again, there wasn't really hostility about it, just we both needed to grow in different ways. So I began doing my own teaching, particularly focusing on the Brahmaviharas. And I did write the stress reduction for lawyers as I was concluding my legal career. I wanted to express my gratitude for that career and to leave something for the lawyers. I haven't really worked with lawyers much. I tried, but it was a really challenging group to work with for me. So that didn't ever turn into anything. But that led to my writing the book Buddha's Heart, maybe 4 years ago or 5 years ago.
Yeah, I didn't read the Stress Reduction for Lawyers book all the way, but I did buy it, and I skimmed it some. I didn't get around to reading it yet, but it did seem a little bit like an early version of the ideas in Buddha's Heart.
Yeah. I was beginning to form, and I was practicing with students who were more ongoing. I was sort of experimenting. Okay. And I was seeing that the heart practices really had a lot of benefit. And I began combining some of the heart practices and the jhana practice. And that really made a difference for folks. Yeah. Just having more heart juiciness in the jhana practice allowed people to go deeper and not get so discouraged if it didn't develop well.
Yeah. And then next came Demystifying Awakening.
Yep. Yeah, I was teaching the Brahmaviharas from Buddha's Heart for a number of years. That was my main offering, because I could see, particularly the Westerners, that many of us were not that connected to our hearts, and most Westerners have very guarded hearts. They're very defended and armored. And so I could see by starting these practices, and I also positioned it from the perspective of the absolute, the source, rather than just as a kind of feel-good, sort of more new age, let's benefit ourselves with affirmations. again, which I'm not criticizing. It's a style, and it works for some people, but I wanted something that was deeper and was more impactful. And also I taught it so that folks could upgrade their relationship with the different groups we call category of beings. And then it became, anyway, getting ahead. And then around that time was when the pandemic was hitting, the COVID pandemic, and we were all on lockdown. And I decided that I was going to come back to koan practice. And so I began working with the teacher, Henry Schuckman, and did, I don't know, 50 or 60 koans, maybe more, maybe less, but did a good body of work with him over a few months. And while he was also learning the jhanas from me, he was doing solo retreat, and I was leading him in the jhana practice. And so I decided, once I concluded a certain portion of work with him, that I wanted to, the lineage he was in, the Sambo Zen, was a little more restrictive than I felt like was the best fit for me. And so I ended up meeting my teacher, Sando Roshi, Mark Sando Minenberg Roshi. He wrote me, having read Buddha's Heart, and he wanted to learn the practices. And so we did a Zoom call, and on that first Zoom call, we both could feel what in Zen we call the mind-to-mind transmission. It was sort of spontaneously happening. So I began teaching him and guiding him in the meditations I knew, and he agreed to not only let me pick up formal koan study with him, but also that he was willing to complete my training by offering me Dharma transmission, which is sort of the PhD work that we do in the Zen tradition. It's the really advanced teachings that are quite pivotal.
Wow, wonderful.
Long answer.
Yeah, yeah. And then in Buddha's Heart, it was interesting. You were talking about like not teaching it the Brahmaviharas, just sort of simple affirmations. I think when I first encountered the Brahmaviharas, I thought they were, it's just this sort of simple purification. Loving kindness to all beings. It's like, yeah, that's a good thought, But the way you teach it is, I'm also a little bit like, okay, let's get to the good stuff, though, like, but not realizing that was the good stuff.
Right. Right.
And then what you're teaching it, though, is it's like really contacting like the unconditional love of the absolute for everything, something, I don't know. Is that kind of how you'd say it?
And it's moving away from sort of the human interpretation of it and going back to the source.
Okay. Yeah.
And it helps a lot in doing that because of our psychology. And I was clear that I wanted to include each of our psychology in the teaching, because even though Zen traditionally didn't practice both the heart practices or really work the personal material, I could see for myself that it was critical to do that. And I guess it would be maybe in the early 2000s, I started working with Diamond Heart, which is a modern mystery school, and particularly with Sandra Maitri, author of the Spiritual Dimensions of the Enneagram. And I worked with her in a larger group for about 15 years, which was really helpful. I really got to work a lot of psychological material because what I didn't share was there was a point when I was about 30 when I had a pretty significant awakening, and really this was a time when it was hard to even find teachers to confirm it. It was just really difficult, and a lot of the early teachers wouldn't confirm lay people kensho. They would do it only for the monastics for whatever reason. And so that was sort of in the background of all this. I was trying to figure out things for myself and stumbling around like crazy. And my teachers could all help with the awakening part, with deepening and expanding that, but not with integration. I mean, I had two teachers. I asked about how do I integrate this? And one said, open the refrigerator with your hara, which is the energy center in the belly. And the other one said, place your awareness in your big toe. So this was the advice I was getting from teachers on what to do, which I didn't find sufficient for my needs.
So understand the chronology, I guess, better. So at age 30 was that first awakening, and then it was more like you're in your mid 40s or something by the time you were authorized in the Theravada tradition. Is that about right?
I was probably probably around 40. Yeah,
Okay, and
a
then
little a
when?
little past, but
Okay, and then when did you practice in the Diamond Heart?
that Diamond Heart started in the early 2000s,
Okay, okay,
and I practiced with Sandra for about 15 years. And I did their 8-year seminary as well, the Diamond Heart
okay,
Seminary.
okay,
I didn't become a teacher in that lineage for a number of reasons, but I valued that training was really excellent. I learned a lot about they focus a lot on psychology and the spiritual interrelationship. So I learned a lot about that was really helpful for me. And then now with students, I understand a lot more about that interface of psychology and personality and awakening.
okay. Interesting. And then that kind of brings us to maybe the next topic is what is it you teach, or like how would you summarize your teachings or the areas that you teach?
Well, overall, I identify as a teacher of awakening. That's the
Okay.
main thrust of the lineage, awakening Dharma lineage that I've started. And we do that both with awakening practices, the traditional Zen practices of shikantaza, just sitting, and also koan practice. And in addition to that is a very healthy engagement with the heart practices, the Brahmaviharas, because we're constantly needing to incorporate, update our heart material. And also, I work with students on personality material as it relates to awakening and spiritual practice. I'm not a therapist, so I'm not doing therapy, but we're looking at the psychological structure in terms of our relationship to the absolute, the source. And I just found in my own process, it's been terribly helpful and important. And then working with students, I can see the same thing. They're becoming more refined people. They're becoming more refined vessels to hold the teachings and the realization. So, because in my early years, a lot of the Zen teachers, I'll say it differently, a number of Zen teachers had behavioral issues. And a lot of it was because the Zen tradition was so focused on emptiness, on the absence quality, that a lot of the teachers viewed all activity as empty. So if I was, if I eat half your sandwich without asking, and if you complained, it was like, well, it's empty. It's all empty. What are you complaining about? This is your issue to work would be how they would position it. And as students, we did that. We took it all on as ours, and they were enlightened. And I look back today, and I wouldn't say they were enlightened. They had awakening, but it was an early awakening. It wasn't yet what I would consider a full awakening. So anyway, that was part of it as well. What was going on in it, and why I emphasize and work with students on psychology. In fact, my new book, Liberating the Self, is specifically addressing those patterns, those practices with different difficult emotions. And then also I present the Theravadan Samatha practices, which are the gradual deconstruction of the self.
It's a
Yeah,
lot.
so I see this all as fitting into an overall theme, which
Yeah.
again is where awakening is the key. And there's the direct awakening path, which is the Zen path, and then there's the gradual awakening path, which is the Theravadan path. Not to say that the Zen can't be gradual and the Theravadan can't be an immediate or direct route too. So it goes different ways, different paths. But I sort of mix and match based on what I feel like people need, and also what the community, what the Sangha can use, or what we can introduce into the lineage.
Okay. Great. And then I'd like to talk also about starting a practice. So let's say someone is new and they're interested in Buddhism, like they've read some books and they think, oh, there seems to be something here, um, but they haven't really started a practice yet. What would be your advice to how they should start?
Well, I think one of the first things I would say would be to really take a little bit of time and reflect on why you feel drawn to this. A lot of people, most of us, feel the suffering of life, what we call the dukkha, and that is what motivates us to a spiritual life. And so understanding that I'm living this life, and interestingly, a lot of people come to practice who are it's either folks who are struggling in life, things are very difficult and challenging, and the other group is people who are socially successful. They have good jobs, good relationships, good families, but there's something about, well, I've realized my potential, and I'm not satisfied. I'm not complete. So either way, there's a kind of a, not everything is here the way I want it. I want things should be different in some way. So look at the motivation for practice first. Get clear about that, and then I'd say to read about the different traditions. Zen, Theravada, Tibetan. If you're interested in Buddhism, and see where you resonate. What makes sense? What feels comfortable to you? Like, to me, the Tibetan was always too complicated. I'm a simpler person than that. But the Zen and the Theravada really work. They're simple in a lot of ways. So that, and then the next step would be to actually start meditating. I tell them to spend 5 minutes every morning meditating. Fortunately, these days, because of the pandemic, there's extensive YouTube videos on how to meditate. I know I've got close to 300 videos on my YouTube page. And so from these YouTube videos, one can find teachers presenting all these practices. So that's a way to find someone to work with and get started, I think.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, I think there's something like you mentioned looking at different traditions. Like I think when I first looked at Zen, it looked so Japanese, like very Japanese. And I think some places present it that way more, but like your presentation is doesn't feel that Japanese really. There's something there too about the particular teacher you end up finding or studying with too. Do they fit? Yeah.
Yeah, part of my evolution as a teacher, and fortunately, Pa-Auk Sayadaw, when he authorized me to teach in 2007, he said two things. I want you to keep the practices exactly as I taught them to you, which I have. All those practices are done exactly how I learned them. And the other was, he said, to build bridges. He said, I know that being an Asian, that I don't know exactly how to communicate to Westerners. I don't understand how that works. And he also had been a monk since he was 10. So he had never had a romantic relationship. He moved out of his family life when he was 10. So he didn't really know what social, an average person in society does or how they live. So fortunately, he gave me that, and that really is how I've preserved my teaching. Everything I teach, I present the way I learned it to keep the continuity of the lineage. But I experiment a lot. I mix and match practices. I try different things because really, I'm looking at what's going to work. This is a period where we're still figuring out what Buddhism is in America. What's our flavor of Buddhism? So to me, that part of that process is being willing to experiment and try new things. And some teachers, as you say, are very traditional. They don't want to mess with the form of practice. They learned a very Japanese style, as I did, and they're preserving it. And to me, it's like, well, that's great, but what's Japanese? What's American? What's Western? And that's really one of the questions I hold to the forefront.
Yeah. And then what about retreats? Like how important is retreat practice? Like for someone new?
Retreat practice is essential. If someone is a serious spiritual practitioner, if they really feel the burn for truth, for awakening, to ultimate reality, then they're going to have to do in-person retreats. Humans are pack animals, and there's something about us sharing a physical field together that impacts everyone. And so that's what I see on the retreats, is that just maintaining the field in a particular way really allows a kind of ripeness to be in the air. So I think that's essential. I would say if somebody is new, if you want to do a retreat, start off small. Start off with an online something, a half day, a day long, something that you can experiment, but you can kind of titrate your reactivity to it and your challenge to make it where it's successful. And then when you have stability, I generally recommend people, if they're going to come on at least one of my retreats, they should be able to sit comfortably for an hour at a time, a couple hours a day. And that usually is the preparatory work I suggest. But for somebody new, pick a topic that's inviting. Particularly the heart practices. Those are ones that everyone can benefit from, regardless of their experience. And start with that. But finding a teacher is challenging too. It's hard. But on retreats, one thing I want to say, on my retreats, what's different is I haven't followed the traditional format where it's very strict and we have meditation, walking, sort of all day and all night. I do it where I've got a schedule, but soon, within a few days, I go to an open sitting where the first hour I'll sit with the group, and then it's up to each person to decide how much they meditate, when they meditate, where they meditate, because I don't require them to meditate in the meditation hall even. They can sit outside in their room, on a couch, wherever they want. And I find that makes it where people can then find their natural rhythm. You can find your strength as a student, as a meditator, because you're following my pattern isn't necessarily going to be beneficial to you. I may have different needs as a meditator than you do.
Yeah, that's a good point too, that there's just really different kinds of retreats. So there's, one starting at 3 a.m., you wake up at 3 a.m. or wake up at 4 a.m. or
Yep.
I think
there's those. Mm-hmm.
There's and then the amount of flexibility you're given in the retreat or not. So I think knowing what kind of retreat you're going to end up on would make a big difference.
Well, and the reason I do it too is because I have people, even people who've been meditating a long time or been on the path a long time, sometimes they have physical issues where they can't physically sit that long. They can't do the very strict schedule they need, or have people that have health issues, they're recovering from cancer, they need to sleep 12 hours a night, or they need some special something. And this allows people to manage all of that themselves. What are your needs in terms of the retreat? What's going to make it supportive? And then at this point in my retreats, I rent large houses to do the retreats in. I'm hoping to fundraise and buy a retreat house next year, but that's still in the works. But anyway, so I try to find places that are comfortable for folks. There's lots of bathrooms. So the basics of life are supported. At this point, I'm doing the cooking on the retreat, and my wife, Julie, does baking of cookies, cakes, pies, whatever you can want, she can make and does.
Yeah.
So anyway, it's a little different, but it gives the retreats a real homey feel. It feels like we're in a house together. We're sharing this living space. I'm cooking for them all, and Julie's baking for everyone. And between the two of us, we're managing whatever needs to be managed in that regard.
Yeah, and that brings up kind of, there's a stylistically, you could be more approach a retreat in a more driven, like, I don't know, non-stop kind of way, or there's kind of I guess you've talked about gentleness and ripeness, and how do you see the advantages of each approach?
Well, I certainly know the rigorous approach. That was how it was in my early days with my teachers. And for me, it was really a good way at that time. I didn't have a really active father in my life growing up. And I think the early Zen years, the hard practice that we did, really provided a sort of a parental substitute for me. I got to see and know my strengths and my weaknesses from that, which I didn't know before. And that I had capacity to stay with things even when they were profoundly painful and extremely difficult, that I had the capacity to stay. So that it encourages a lot of endurance. You have a capacity for suffering that increases. Not that you were masochists, but we're learning to stay present to difficulties. But what I found with that style is that there wasn't much room for individuation. So it was really a one size fits all sort of approach. And what I found as a teacher is that people are very particular. You know, they have very specific upbringings and come from different, not only families, but cultures and sometimes nations. And so I found you have to have some accommodation for all that, because there's just what's beneficial for one person may not be for another. So that's where it needs, to me, I've come up with some fluidity on the retreats, and that way folks can play to their strengths. If they're really good meditators, morning meditators, they can meditate really well then. And if they're lousy in the afternoon, they can do yoga and go for a hike or take a nap or whatever is beneficial to them. You know, so it's also recognizing your own biorhythms as a student and capitalizing on those.
Yeah. Yeah. And it seems like it's a serious practice still, because people are coming pretty motivated, but
very motivated.
Yeah.
And I will say, like, I just did a retreat in October, a 3-week awakening retreat, and there was almost no time when I went into the hall, day or night, when somebody wasn't sitting, and usually more than one person. And people would report, oh, I got in there at 2 a.m. this morning and there were 4 people meditating. I'm like, great. I wasn't awake then, but I'm glad to hear it. So I tell people, you know, when you're motivated, when you feel the pull to sit. It's important to recognize that rhythm.
Yeah, I was on that retreat. I was not up at 2 a.m. though.
Well, I guess we're not the real hardcore students.
I guess not. Yeah.
Oh well.
No, I have something to strive for the next one, I guess.
No, I wouldn't encourage that.
Okay. And then I want to talk about teachers. How important is it to work with a teacher versus do it yourself? Or I've heard a lot of people too, where they're teachers, whoever they happen to be on retreat with this time. What do you think of the essentialness of a teacher, or not, or when? Yeah.
When to get one. Yeah. I think particularly when one is starting, these days, it's pretty easy to get started because, again, there's so much on YouTube and so many books. And anyway, there's just lots of material. So finding instructions or finding teaching isn't hard. For the beginners, I think to start on your own is perfectly fine to do if you have a video or a book or something to just get started. But I think once you start getting established, once you're clear this is going to be a life path for you, then I think it becomes important to find a teacher. As you mentioned, there are some people, their teachers are whoever interests them at this time, so they move around a lot. And I have some of those students where they'll sit with me some and then disappear for a while and be back. And so some folks that works for. Other folks, they're just not ready to commit to one teacher yet. But I think if somebody is really serious, I mean, if somebody really wants to wake up, if they want to wake up and live from that awakening, then they have to work with a teacher, because it's really easy to fool ourselves. Early in my career, my meditation career, I several times was completely fooled, where I had some form of peak or transcendent experience. And every time I had one, I was convinced I was enlightened, that this is it. I'm done. Everything, I'm 23 years old or something. Okay, I'm done. I'm fully enlightened now. And then, of course, invariably within hours or days, the bubble would pop, and I'd be pretty much back to where I started. And luckily, there were teachers even then who were willing to bring out a pin to my balloon and be willing to pop it for me. So I appreciate that, as painful as it was at the time to learn I wasn't fully enlightened. Um, it's useful, but picking a teacher is also has its challenges, because you want to pick somebody both that you respect and you admire, but you want to have somebody where there's a real clear channel of communication and where you kind of get each other. It's sort of like a spiritual dating. There has to be sort of an attraction, a mutual attraction. We get each other, we like each other. Our communication is clear, and that usually is the best relationship. And I certainly don't see myself as the best teacher for everyone. I don't think that's true. But the people that are attracted to my teaching and how I work really do well. And on that awakening retreat you were on, we had an incredible amount of awakenings, Zen Kensho and Theravadan cessation experiences, no self, unity experiences. Virtually everybody had at least one, if not more than one of those. So it was an incredibly successful retreat in terms of the result, what people experienced. So that tells me that we're onto something in the style that I'm presenting, in the way the retreats are being run. They're working. And so, but for the people attracted, this isn't a one size fits all. I'm not a teacher for everyone by any stretch. Some people need teachers that are more touchy feely than I am, or they need teachers who are more severe than I am. And that's what they feel attracted to, or they may need. So it's also being willing to experiment, to try. I've had a number of different teachers, so different periods of my life, certain teachers or practices were needed or attractive.
Yeah. Yeah. No, for me, when I first started, I was very happy just to practice on my own, and to got started practicing just reading that Practicing the Jhanas book. Mm-hmm. That was the main thing I practiced out of for the first several months. And then it was really watching YouTube and finding teachers that I kind of liked or respected some, and they all said it was essential to have a teacher. So that's how I ended up reaching out to you, was listening to that advice. And I think I agree with it. With hindsight, definitely agree with it 100%.
I was just going to add that, but also when people start having awakening experiences, when they start having unity, love experiences, they really need a teacher to help them see and figure out what happened. Because we can have a lot of false starts. We can have sort of faux awakenings where we have pieces, or we see something more clearly than we saw yesterday. And then we take that as something really important. And it may be important, but it may not be a realization. So that's where it's really important. And like with our relationship, I've gotten to know you from the retreats you've done and the programs you've attended. So I know how you practice. I know your strengths. I know where, sometimes you need a little more support. So that's part of the ongoing relationship too, is we learn each other's rhythms, and hopefully, for taking our relationship as an example, hopefully we can continue to grow as your practice deepens and as we have further realizations and understanding. Our relationship has the capacity to grow. It could come to a point when you feel like you've learned from me everything you can, that you've had realizations either I haven't had or I can't support, where maybe it might be time to find another teacher. And, so that's always a possibility too. There's sometimes people will study with me for a few years. They reach a certain point that they're satisfied with, and they find another teacher that does something that's intriguing to them. So as a teacher, I don't expect people to stay with me for life. People do stay. I think it benefits them most definitely. I'm not saying that people should leave, but it does happen.
Yeah. What is the role of a teacher, you would say?
That's a big question. I think there's a number of roles a teacher plays. I'd say the first one is hopefully presenting the practice material in a way that's clear. And also, I would hope that the teacher is fully experienced in whatever they're teaching. Some of the early teachers in the West, some of them went over to Asia for maybe 6 months or a year and then came back and were teaching. Well, there's a lot of people who have been practicing for 6 months or a year that I wouldn't authorize to teach. We're just getting started. So there's also making sure the teacher is attained in whatever they're teaching, and ideally making sure they've studied with qualified teachers. They're part of a lineage. I'm not someone who's a fan of teachers that are self-appointed teachers that are not part of a lineage. I think the lineage is a kind of a backdrop or safety net, and there's a lot of experience in each of the lineages. There's thousands of teachers, hundreds of thousands of teachers who have learned, who have tried things. So I think lineage teacher is important. And I think the student should expect that the teacher is going to be supportive. You can be friendly, but you're not exactly friends. You're intimates, but you're not exactly intimate either. It's kind of a little of this, little of that relationship. But as a teacher, I also need to maintain some autonomy. So I do hold back some from all the relationships with students, because it's the gap between us that is where we work. So if we're too intimate, it doesn't give us enough workspace, in my view. So that's important as well. So,
Yeah.
and you want a student, you want a teacher who gets you,
Yeah.
who
Yeah.
sees you. That's very important.
Yeah. Yeah. I think, I mean, my analogy, which I don't know if you like or not, but I think it's a little bit like a teacher's a little bit like Google Maps. Like you can get out all these charts and try and figure out your way, to make your way across the country. But if you have someone kind of guiding you and saying, "Oh, maybe turn left here, turn right there," like even
Yep.
even if it's not a perfect process, it really doesn't need to be. It's still going to help get you where you want to go, hopefully,
Well,
in a way that yeah, in a way that self guided isn't going to do it the same way. Yeah.
Yep. Well, and the advantage a teacher has is from the Google Maps. For example, I may know the road really well that you're wanting to travel on, and I may know it's under construction, so there's a detour.
Yeah.
Or that particular route isn't the best for you because you're afraid of heights. So let's find a flat route for you.
Yeah.
So it's a lot of that too, the understanding the application of practice, because we all take to the practice differently. It's completely individualistic. Your experience with the koans or heart practices is going to be similar, but not identical to anybody else's.
Yeah.
So that's important to hold that too, that you're going to have your own way through it.
Yeah. And then you brought up autonomy, which I thought was interesting. Was like, how much, like, do you need to agree with your teacher? How much, like,
yes, of course, you'll give me everything I say. That would be the best for me. No, I think probably the main reason I became Buddhist was one line the Buddha repeated, which is, don't believe anything I've said just because I've said it. Believe it when it's your experience.
yeah.
And that's attracted me a lot. And that's part of my teaching too, is I'm going to present things that'll be theory at start for people. So I'd encourage them to hold it favorably as a possibility. And then as they get experience, compare their experience to the teaching. Does it match? Does it track? Where is it different? Where is it the same? And so that's how it helps to have a map. But a teacher, particularly if they're really skilled, the other thing that I can do is that there are times when people are very close to awakening, and I can try to find something that will burst the balloon. So that's the other thing, is like being on that live retreat we just did in October. There were a number of people who were right on the cusp of awakening, and I was able to, in our one-on-ones, our daily one-on-ones, I was able to say something, do something that sparked the awakening for them. And it's not a logical way that happens. It's very spontaneous and mysterious. But that's the other thing that's possible with a teacher. Not all teachers can do that. Some can, some can't. But if you have a teacher that can, and you're a close student, it can be really beneficial.
Okay. And then how would you say a spiritual teacher is different than like a therapist?
Well, most of therapy is focused on improving the egoic structure, the personality, making us more functional, less dysfunctional. So definitely necessary. I've done therapy. I know most teachers I know have done therapy at some point. So I think therapy itself is beneficial when one can benefit from it. I don't think someone needs a lifetime of therapy unless there's some really serious issues. But so I'm interested in people having healthy personalities. We need to be wholesome enough in our personality that we can put it down at appropriate times in our practice. And if we're not as wholesome in our personality, it can be really difficult to put down. So we need to be enough, I view it as the personality is the vessel, and it holds the teaching, it holds the realization. But we need to improve the vessel at the same time we're opening the realization. So that's really a lot of my teaching, is both the improving the personality at the same time we're oriented to deep practice.
Yeah. So that would be kind of like being, I guess, well adjusted enough. Like everyone probably still is carrying some issues, but you're mostly well adjusted enough, and that's when
Yeah.
that's what you want therapy for, is to get you to that point, I guess.
Yeah, and there are people, I've had students who really needed therapy. So some of whom needed it in such a such an intense way that it really wasn't suitable for them to practice yet. They needed more stability in their personality and their work. And there are people who've had very traumatic childhoods, very, very difficult, hard, awful things have happened that they need to work on. And some people, from their upbringing, their personalities didn't develop in a normal way. They have attachment issues. They have trouble connecting to others. There's a variety of things. And some of those, I encourage people to resolve, to sort out before they really get deep in practice, because the concern is that there may be harm to their structure.
Okay. And so practice might still be helpful for them, but maybe not in a deep way until they're resolving some of that trauma to some extent, at least. Or
yeah, I would say a lot of the most of the heart practices would be beneficial for that person. They could be doing those along with working with therapists. And I have a number of students who are therapists, a lot of therapists in Buddhism. And so a lot of them incorporate some of the meditations, particularly the innate goodness and the deep acceptance of equanimity, are both practices I hear a lot of them are offering and teaching to their clients, so they have a foot in meditation along with their therapy.
Then one last question on teaching, and that's how might someone tell if they're working with the wrong teacher? Is there some tips that you wish you had earlier on that I don't know if you ever worked with the wrong teacher or not, but
well, I think I think that's a good question, because when you're around the teacher, you should feel like you fit. Like there's a a harmonization that's happening. Not that you always agree or any of that. I'm not going to that level, but it should feel like I'm at the right place. And I encourage new folks to look at my more senior students, such as you, and do you want to be living life the way you see that person doing? Because that's probably how you're going to look down the road. And looking at me as a teacher, do you resonate with me? Do you feel like the realization that's here is one that would be a good or great one to have if this is where you landed? But a teacher, particularly if there's a lot of like I worked with one teacher who was extremely critical of students, and that was their style, was to really point out mistakes and faults. And for me, it wasn't a good approach. That was more similar to my birth family, so that was not what I needed. Also, if there's teachers that have issues around behavior, teachers who have slept with students, teachers who have been unwise handling money with students, things like that can be problematic. I mean, there are teachers who I know of who have slept with students, and there's lineages where it's been a problem, and it's just, there's a lot of reasons for that to happen. But that's the kind of thing, to me, I wouldn't work with a teacher who has a problem sleeping with students, because I'm not going to know if there's senior people in that sangha, are they there because of realization? Are they there because of relationship? So it undermines the integrity of the group when that happens. In Awakening Dharma, part of the teacher policy is teachers cannot date or sleep with students. So it's just a no, a flat no. That doesn't happen, because just having that as a possibility creates lots of problems. So I think check out the teachers, talk to people in the sangha, but you want to find somebody you resonate with, and also that you respect. And if you had their realization, you'd be like, I'm really great with this. So that's part of it too.
Yeah. Okay. And then I think that's pretty much it. So thank you.
You're welcome.
When is your new book coming out?
Yeah, my next book, Liberating the Self, will be out, I'm told, March 18th.
Cool.
And I've just started my next one, so that one's in process.
Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you
Good.
very much.
Thanks very much.
Yeah.
Appreciate
Yeah.
it.
All right. Thanks.
Bye now.